Running an NBA team is an incredibly difficult thing to do. And yes, you have to make trades, you have to make free agency decisions, you have to make contract decisions. But the biggest thing you have to do is you have to plan. You have to think about the future. You have to think about the direction of your team. Where do you want to be at the end of the season? Where do you want to be 5 years from now? There are some things happening right now in the NBA that are making that incredibly difficult. And to me, the most interesting aspect of that is the possibility of the NBA expanding and adding multiple franchises over the next couple of seasons. It's something that I've talked about in a recent video in terms of expansion itself. And now let's talk about what an expansion draft would look like in the NBA. Now, the way that this would work, or at least how it has worked in the past, is teams would have the opportunity to protect 8 players on their roster that are not allowed to be drafted in the expansion draft. You're only allowed to protect 8 guys. Everybody else on the roster is eligible for the draft, and you can only have 1 guy taken from your team. Now, depending on how many teams the league decides to add, if they add 4 teams, they might have to change up some of those rules a little bit, but that's the understanding that we're working off of from previous expansion drafts. And that's a really difficult thing to plan for if you were an NBA GM, because you're just losing guys for nothing. You're not getting anything in exchange for them in a trade. And a good amount of the time, like, these are players that either play for you now and are in your rotation, or that you kind of have plans for down the road. And if you're not picking the right guys and protecting the right players, you could potentially lose a really critical piece. And there's a couple of teams I want to talk about here in terms of who they could or could not possibly protect. First, I want to talk about the Brooklyn Nets, because it's really interesting when you look at their roster. By the time you get to 8 guys, it's pretty easy to say, you know what, maybe they shouldn't protect Ben Simmons. And that might sound crazy to some people, given that he was the centerpiece of the James Harden trade, and in theory, he should be a relatively significant piece for Brooklyn, but he's on a gigantic contract. You have no idea if he's going to be able to help your team throughout the entirety of that contract, and it's realistic to expect that a team might actually want Ben Simmons in an expansion draft, because there is still the possibility and the upside of him potentially being, you know, an all-star caliber player once again, once he figures some stuff out, and he's so young. And so if you're Brooklyn, you could look at the situation and say, you know what, we would rather get rid of the salary of Ben Simmons. We'd rather put him in the expansion draft, let another team take on the contract. He's just gone. He just doesn't exist anymore, and we move forward. And we'd rather keep someone like Cam Thomas, someone like Day'Ron Sharpe. We'd rather protect those guys and hope that someone takes Ben Simmons. And then if you're an expansion team, you have this guy that has the upside potentially of an all-star caliber player if he can figure it out. What I'm curious about, your guys, and anybody watching this video, would you, if you're Brooklyn, would you want to keep Ben Simmons in the expansion draft? And if you're an expansion team, would you want Ben Simmons potentially? I think that's a really interesting situation to try and plan for. But that by no means is the only team that has some really interesting expansion decisions to make. Again, I think this is going to be a thing. I think they're definitely going to expand the league soon, and these are decisions teams are going to have to make. What about the Minnesota Timberwolves and Rudy Gobert? Because when you look at their roster, they've got a handful of really interesting players. You can get to a top 8 that doesn't include Rudy Gobert pretty easily. And the thought process would be, if we leave him unprotected, we really desperately hope that someone takes him. Because if you don't leave him, or if you do leave him unprotected, nobody takes him, it's just awkward to bring him back to the team. And obviously, it's similar to the Simmons thing, where he has a gigantic contract, although Rudy, of course, is older. You're worried about his declining play, and you just kind of want to get out of the trade that you made. You want to just, you know what, I know we gave up a ton of stuff, but let's just move on from this situation. And again, if you're an expansion team, when you're looking at the level of players that could potentially be available in an expansion draft, Rudy Gobert, think about him what you want, is going to be the best player in the entire expansion draft if he does get let go by Minnesota. And you have to think about, is that a good idea for us? Ultimately, Minnesota probably keeps Gobert, even though it would save them a ton of money, potentially provide them some flexibility, because the whole reason that they made the trade was to try and be good, to try and maybe win a title or make the finals or be a competitive postseason team. And they really didn't get that much of an opportunity to see him alongside Karl-Anthony Towns and with Anthony Edwards. And so if things go that way again this year and they're not very good, maybe next year, maybe when the expansion draft actually rolls around, they will make that decision to go ahead and get rid of Rudy Gobert in the expansion draft. But I do think it's an interesting conversation. And again, similar to the Simmons thing, is that something that you would do if you were either the expansion team or the Timberwolves? And then you get to some of these teams that have a lot of really interesting young players, teams that have been stockpiling, assets and first round picks and all these things for years. And suddenly they're kind of out of guys that they can protect. So like Oklahoma City is going to be the biggest example of this, where you get through their top 8 and then you're left with, maybe Poku is available, maybe Jang is available, maybe Trey Mann is available in an expansion draft. And you're only going to lose one of those guys, but you do have to make some decisions in terms of like, who do we actually want to keep? Who's really a key piece of our roster moving forward? And Oklahoma City specifically is in an interesting situation here, because they do have all that talent, but also they showed last year they can be a legitimately good team. This isn't isn't just a tanking situation anymore. And so do you always want to constantly think about the future still, or do you maybe want to give up someone like Jang with the idea being, you know what, we're going to make sure that we keep, one of our guys that actually is going to help us win this season? That's some of the difficult decisions that just make this a really difficult situation to be a GM in. If I'm Oklahoma City, I'm not letting Jang go. That's just me, but I can understand how you could potentially get to that process. Another team here would be someone like the New Orleans Pelicans in a similar, kind of mold here where they have all these young guys and even their 9th, 10th, 11th best players that you might leave unprotected in an expansion draft. You'd be really concerned about letting one of those guys go. Like, do you end up losing someone like Dyson Daniels, which sounds crazy because he was a top 10 pick a year ago. But when you're looking at your roster, guys that are actually going to contribute this season, is Dyson Daniels going to play more than 15 minutes a game for you? I really don't know. And that's just because of how crazy deep your team is. And this is just an unprecedented situation. You would almost never, ever plan on this if you were a GM. You would never think, oh, well, what if we just lose some guy that's on a rookie contract and we're not trading him away? He's not leaving free agency. He's just gone. It's a really difficult thing to plan for. Memphis is another team. They've got all these guys. They've had multiple first round picks over the last few seasons. They've got Zaire Williams. They've got David Roddy. They've got Jake LaRavia. They've got Santi Aldama. Like, they've got a ton of guys that they think are eventually going to play for them. Xavier Tillman, Brandon Clark coming off of an injury. And you're thinking, how can we possibly keep all of our guys? And you want all of them to stay. Who amongst that group do you decide to leave unprotected? And then the ultimate one to me would be Golden State, because they've got, this would only count for this year, and expansion's obviously not happening this year. But for example, let's just say that it did. You'd have Chris Paul, maybe Moody, Gary Payton, maybe. Like, certainly you're not giving up someone like Kuminga. There's just a lot of situations when you look around at these different teams around the league where I do not envy the position that some of these GMs are going to be in over the next couple of seasons, where it seems really easy. Just be like, oh, well, the 9th best player on the team and the 10th best player on the team, like, those guys aren't actually going to be that impactful or that important for our future. It's not really that big of a deal to just protect the top 8 guys. But with some of these rosters, it is actually a really big deal. And the thing that sucks about it is it's only a big deal because they've done a good job of building their team. They're actually kind of getting punished for building their team well, for having all these assets, for having all these interesting young players. And you don't really just want to get rid of any of those guys. And no matter how much you've planned as a GM over the last couple of seasons, or maybe you just got there, no matter how much you plan and you've thought about the future, having to just lose players in an expansion draft, something that's only happened a few times in the history of the league, isn't something you're going to spend a ton of time planning for. And I can't wait for when this actually happens, certainly from a content perspective, but just overall seeing the decisions that teams make, really getting down to the details of like how much they value their individual players. Are you willing to give up someone with maybe some upside like Ben Simmons in the future, or you want to get rid of the contract of him or Rudy Gobert, or like I said, the Golden State Warriors decisions they would possibly make? How much do you really value these guys? So you can say publicly about how, oh, this guy's a big part of our future and we really want to keep this guy and that guy. We want to maintain our young assets. But when it comes down to it, are you willing to lose a player that actually plays for you for the upside and the potential? How much do you truly value these guys? And those kinds of decisions would be terrifying for me if I was a GM, because there's no other situation you can equate it to where a player under contract that you're not trading for value is just gone from your team. And in some situations, gone from your team when you're actively trying to win the title and or you're giving up a relatively significant piece of your future. And so I want you guys to do is go around the league, look at some of these teams, and let me know down in the comment section below what some of these toughest decisions you think are around the league in terms of who you would or you would not keep in a top 8 expansion draft situation.